Hello, Truth Prospector is back to help you dig up some truth. I'm continuing on the series about revelations of John of Patmos and want to expose some light to it. I was reading this book called The Spurious Book of Revelation Revisited by Steve Santini. And I wanted to read this with you because it touched me and it taught me a lot about history and convinced me more in my beliefs that it's not an inspired book. But I want to read Steve Santini's comments and his work, and I'm going to add my comments as we go along. This is part one. The Spurious Book of Revelation Revisited by Steve Santini. I want to share this man's writing and add my comments as we go along. Steve said, should the book of Revelation be in the Bible? Comparisons of the contents of Paul's writings and those from the author of the book of Revelation reveal stark contrasts. And the church history reveals that the John who authored Revelations was a different person than John who wrote the fourth gospel that does contain elements supporting Paul's revelation. Further, church history and Revelation's content itself identify the anti-Pauline community that spawned its author and that has fundamentally distorted Christian doctrine to today. And I say, so did Paul the apostle receive revelation of Jesus Christ, or did John of Patmos? Steve said the four Gospels were universally accepted as authoritative during the second century Christian church. By the end of the second century, although diminished in relation to the Gospels, the Pauline writings were widely considered as apostolically genuine. As such, the Gospels and the Pauline writings form the basis for the developing canon of Scripture. On the other hand, the book of Revelation was widely rejected as canonical until the 7th century. It was not until the late 4th century that the book gained a foothold of official acceptance in the Latin-speaking West as a result of a regional synod or council of Carthage. Now, you can read more about that if you want to use Wikipedia. It taught me a lot. You can Wikipedia the councils of Carthage. You can Wikipedia Cyprian, Cyprian, and you can Wikipedia Lapsi, Lapsi, Christianity. In my study, I found that after the execution of Pope Fabian, Bishop Cyprian of Carthage went into hiding. When he returned to Carthage, he found these confessors assumed authority of clergy, especially over forgiveness of sin. Although many confessors willingly relinquished their possessions of authority upon the clergy's return, some attempted to retain their positions. Cyprian called a council in 251 AD to address this problem, the root of which was the status of the lapsi, the ones that didn't take the vaccine, or the ones that did take the vaccine to cross the border. Well, do you forgive them? Interesting that during 250 AD, the Decian persecution was against Christ and the Christians, but the Jews were exempted from worshiping the Caesar? Some kind of connection there. And you can see that if you Wikipedia Decian persecution. Novatian was not acting as a Christian at all, but he took over the church as the Pope, and he began the Church of the Pure. No lapses allowed here. Oh no, if you got impure blood, you've been vaccinated, you can just not come here. No, he wasn't acting like a Christian. I personally do not see how outward actions affect your worship to God. Our actions start with our worship and then comes out in the actions in our mouth and our hands. Some may be called to be martyrs, but many are called to run and hide, like Cyprian. Or we would not even have Christians living in the world today where they're needed. St. Cyprian of Carthage later accused Novatian of striking his pregnant wife in the stomach and causing an abortion. Well, I can believe that. His fruits show he was a legalist and only interested in controlling the church, not serving it to heal its wounds after it went through a horrible persecution. He was a legalist. St. Cyprian writes that Novatian took over and sent new epistles to many cities to get them to accept his election. Propaganda, that was their internet. Although all the provinces and all the cities held bishops of venerable age, pure faith, proven virtue, who had been proscribed during the persecution, Cyprian writes that Novatian dared to replace them with brand new bishops that he created himself. So then, from the 3rd century, we entered a pure church. Perhaps all the true Christians had survived this horrible time of persecution because they saved themselves rather than died. Perhaps this persecuted church were being called lapsi, and the false brothers took over. Perhaps it was at this time that the true believers were excommunicated and replaced by a human-controlled hierarchy. Novatian disagreed with this viewpoint, and he believed that reconciling those who had lapsed would compromise the integrity of the church. Novatian he was arguing that idolatry was unforgivable sin and that the church had no right to readmit lapsed members to communion. It was during the time for the fight of controlling the church that this book of John's Revelation was being accepted at the councils of Carthage. I think this was a very dark time for the church. Arguing that idolatry was an unforgivable sin and that the church had no right to readmit lapsy members to communion, Novatian argued that the church could not admit penitent. They could only admit penitent to penitence for life, but only God could grant forgiveness. They really had the Christ image, didn't they? Such a position was not completely new, as Tertullian had criticized Pope Calixtus' introduction of pardons for adultery. Even St. Hippolytus was inclined towards severity, and laws were promulgated in many places at many times to punish determined sinners with excommunication, ending at the hour of death, or even refusing them communion at the hour of death. Wow. Closing the gates of heaven. Sounds like Pharisees to me. But we shall continue with part 2.